You're here now, so breathe slow, let the hum of the world quiet itself for a moment, and come closer to this edge where your thoughts can drift like slow clouds. Tonight we are going to slip into something vast and patient, a question that lingers behind your eyes when you look at the moon and wonder how far its pull really reaches. We won't rush, we'll drift, we'll listen to secrets the tide knows but never says aloud. Be careful though, curiosity is gentle, but once it takes hold it tugs at you like a tide of its own. Once you feel it, you might not come back the same, but don't worry, you're safe here, and I'll guide you through every hush and ripple. Remember, if you ever feel your mind wandering too far, you can always pause, rest, and breathe again. If you're ready now, find a soft place to sit or lie down, maybe near a window, maybe in the hush of your bed somewhere you can hear the night breathe with you. Good, now lean a little closer, let's begin. The attic where I spend my nights is not much higher than the trees outside, yet it feels suspended somewhere between this world and another, a place where thoughts float as easily as dust motes in the moon's pale spill. The floorboards know my footsteps by heart, they barely creak now when I cross them at this hour, when the house below has surrendered to sleep. Sometimes I think if I press my ear against the wood I might hear the sighs of old dreams settling into the beams, or the soft rush of centuries passing through the grain. Tonight I find myself at the small round window again, the glass cool beneath my fingertips, the smell of salt and distant waves drifting in through the narrow crack I leave open. The ocean is far enough that I can't hear it clearly, yet near enough that I feel it inside my ribs, that steady slow hush, like a breath larger than the sky. I wonder what the moon feels when it looks down on all this water, on the quiet rooftops, on me standing here half hidden behind a curtain of my own doubt. People say the moon pulls the ocean, but I can't help thinking maybe it calls to us too, some low frequency that slips between our waking thoughts and curls up in the corners of our sleep. Maybe that's why I keep coming back to this window night after night, not for answers exactly, but for the chance to stand on the edge of something immeasurable, to feel the weight of my questions balanced by the hush of the sea. I remember being small enough to believe the moon was a light someone forgot to turn off. I would lie in my bed, with the blankets pulled up over my chin, and imagine a giant hand reaching down to cup the earth, a careful thumb brushing over mountains and forests the way my mother brushed crumbs from the kitchen table. That image stayed with me longer than it should have, stubborn as a seashell in a pocket long after the beach is gone. Now I know about gravity, tidal forces, the push and pull of mass, and distance equations that anchor the moon to us and us to it in a slow cosmic waltz. But knowing has never stopped me from wondering what secrets hide behind the numbers, what soft promises hum through the darkness when no one is listening but the water and me. Tonight my telescope waits in the corner, its slender barrel aimed not at the moon, but at a patch of sky just beyond where its light spills. I like to look past the obvious to the dark spaces where stars gather like gossip. Sometimes I imagine if I stared long enough I'd see not just stars, but the echoes of stars, the light from things long vanished but not yet done speaking. They say when you look far enough into the sky you look back in time. I suppose that means every night is a lesson in memory, the universe's way of reminding us that nothing ever really leaves, it only shifts, changes, fades into something else, just as the tide never disappears, it only steps away to catch its breath before returning. I pull the telescope closer, position my eye against the lens, the world narrowing to a single circle of possibility. It's strange how much bigger everything feels when you look at it through a narrow glass tunnel, how the smallest fleck of starlight becomes an entire story waiting to be heard. I find a faint smudge, a galaxy maybe, or a cluster of stars pretending to be one. It flickers at the edge of sight, a heartbeat I can't quite catch. Part of me wants to call it by name, as if naming it might anchor it here with me, but another part prefers the not knowing the way uncertainty makes space for wonder to breathe. Below the attic, the world keeps its steady human pace. The heater hums, the pipes sigh, a car door thuds somewhere in the street. I imagine everyone tucked into their beds, convinced that tomorrow will arrive, as planned, unaware that above them, the universe is busy folding light, weaving dark, laying down ripples of gravity, so subtle we never feel their passage until we do. The moon meanwhile drifts through all this unseen work, its quiet pull steady enough to lift oceans, yet soft enough to leave my thoughts untouched until I invite them to drift. Sometimes I wish I could see the path my thoughts take when I stand here at this window, or bend over this telescope. Do they spiral out like waves spreading from a single stone, or do they shoot straight and sure like comets flaring against the dark? Maybe they do both. Maybe thought is just another kind of tide retreating inward only to surge back stronger, reshaped by the depth it touched. When I finally pull away from the lens, the attic feels larger than before, the shadows deeper, the hush more complete. I let the night wrap around my shoulders, like a blanket still cool from the ocean's breath. I think of the whales out there somewhere deep beneath the waves, following invisible roads of magnetic pull and ancient song. They trust currents they cannot see, they surface only to slip back down, trusting salt and darkness to carry them home. I wonder what they would think of my questions, my little telescope, my endless window. Maybe they would tell me there is no need to know, only to feel the tug and follow where it leads. I like to imagine the moon nodding at that idea, silent agreement drifting down in pale beams across the attic floor. When I finally move away from the window, I keep the sea's hush inside me, a pocket of tide I can carry back to my bed. My footsteps are careful, deliberate, as if I'm trying not to wake the floorboards from their own dreaming. I settle beneath the blanket, close my eyes, but the moon stays with me anyway, silver thumbprint behind my eyelids marking the place where questions rest until the tide returns. And it always does. Returning is what the ocean knows best, its promise folded into each wave that slips quietly up the shore then slides. When I left that attic behind, I thought I was leaving the moon's pull there, too boxed up between old puzzles and my mother's telescope. But the truth is, you cannot leave the moon any more than you can leave the slow beating of your own heart, so I carried it with me, though I didn't know it at first, not until I found myself years later standing at the edge of another coast, my shoes sinking into cold sand that squeaked under my weight, and the wind brushing my face with the same salt that once drifted through the crack in my attic window. I was older now, but not so different inside, still watching the water, still wondering if I could feel the tug of that distant white stone that never tires of lifting oceans or secrets. I had come to this quiet town because I needed a place where the noise of the world could fall away, a place where I could hear my own thoughts again, or maybe stop hearing them so loudly. Whichever came first, I rented a small cabin close enough to the dunes that I could stand on the porch at night and see the silver ribbon of the tide unwinding under the moon's soft watch. I brought only what I needed: a few clothes, some notebooks, a battered thermos for coffee, and my mother's telescope, which I had found in the back of a closet, still heavy with the smell of dust and old nights, its tripod a little rusted, but the lens clear as memory. The first night I set it up outside the cabin, the sky was veiled in low drifting clouds that swallowed stars, and even the moon for a time, so I sat on the steps of the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sea's slow breathing, and feeling that familiar hush settle over my shoulders. I thought about how strange it is that we measure time by what we see: the sun's path, the moon's phases, the slipping of shadows across floors and faces, yet we carry another clock inside us, the tide clock, the hush clock, the part of us that listens to something older than calendars or alarms. It tells us when to wake, when to drift, when to come back to shore. I must have dozed there on the steps, because when I opened my eyes, the clouds had broken, and the moon hung there patient and indifferent as ever, its light spilling across the dunes, making every grain of sand glow like tiny bones. I lifted the telescope, turned its quiet eyes skyward, and found the familiar scars and plains that had kept me company so many nights before. They looked no different, yet I felt changed just to see them again. I thought about the light touching my, how it had bounced from the sun to the moon, and then down through the thin glass to where I sat alone at the edge of the continent. I wondered if that light remembered its journey the way I remembered mine, if it carried the warmth of the sun even as it bounced from rock to rock until it found me. I adjusted the focus and found the edge of a crater rimmed in shadow, and for a moment I felt I was peering into a well too deep to see the bottom, a hole not of emptiness but of time itself. Somewhere in that dark a piece of the past slept undisturbed. I wished I could slip inside it, leave my present self on the porch, and float down into that soft lunar night where gravity is less certain, and every step sends up a quiet halo of dust. The sea answered my wish with a soft hush that drifted up the dunes and settled at my feet, reminding me where I was, reminding me that the moon's pull is never about escape, but about return. The tide doesn't run away from shore, it reaches as far as it can, then comes back, folding over itself. With a sigh, I packed the telescope away for the night, but before I slipped inside, I stood for a moment longer, toes curling in the cold sand, moonlight tracing the lines of my hands. I thought about how we're all pulled by things we can't see, how we orbit memories, places, people. Even when we think we've broken free, we circle back, drawn by an invisible thread stronger than any vow. I thought about my mother, how she must have looked through this same lens once when she was young. Maybe she too wondered if the light she saw remembered her. Maybe she never spoke of it, because some things are better left as quiet truths held inside, like a small hidden tide. I fell asleep that night with the window cracked, so I could hear the ocean, the wind tugging at the eaves, like an old friend checking in. My dreams were scattered images of light bouncing from wave to wave, carrying secrets across dark water. When I woke, the sky was pale, the moon slipping below the horizon like a secret. Retreating into the hush of dawn, I made coffee, sat on the porch wrapped in the same blanket, and watched the sandpipers dart in and out of the surf, their tiny legs scribbling lines that vanished as the water returned, each wave erasing the proof of their passing. Yet they kept running forward, fearless of the tide that always took back what it touched. I found it comforting, this endless undoing, this promise that nothing stays fixed, that even the deepest mark is softened by time and salt. The day passed in slow ripples. I walked the shore, let the wind braid my thoughts into something quieter. I picked up bits of shell, marveling at how even broken pieces could catch the light if you turn them just right. I thought about tides of thought, how some ideas drift away only to return when the mind is still enough to let them land. That evening, as dusk softened the sky, I made a small fire in the pit near the porch, flames flickering like tiny echoes of the sun's forgotten warmth. I watched sparks drift upward, trying to join the stars that had begun to prick the dark. I thought of the moon rising again somewhere behind me, ready to lit the ocean one more time, and I felt the hush settle in again, that soft reminder that even here, far from my attic, I was never really apart from the quiet pull that hums through bone and blood, a promise that the ocean will always answer the moon, and I will always find my way back to this gentle hush. I woke on the third morning to a sky washed clean by rain, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and salt, as if the ocean had come closer in the night, stretching its cold fingers across the dunes to tap gently at my door. I stepped outside, wrapped in my thickest sweater, feeling the damp wood of the porch beneath my bare feet, and watched low clouds drift like soft ghosts across the pale mouth of dawn. The tide was high, swallowing more of the beach than I'd yet seen. Since coming here, the waves folded themselves over and over in a hush that felt both ancient and new, the way a familiar face surprises you in a dream though you've known it forever. I made my coffee slowly, letting the kettle hiss and steam as if the sound could keep time from rushing me, and when I stepped back outside, cup warming my hands, I felt the hush again, that gentle reminder that here things move not at my pace, but at the pace of wind and water, and the quiet promise the moon makes without a single word. I wondered if I would ever stop thinking about that pull, how it seemed to thread through every thought, every breath, as if I were tethered by some invisible cord to that distant sphere drifting above, even when hidden behind gray clouds. Maybe it was the same pull that had brought me here alone to this salt-bitten cabin, the same pull that kept me at this porch watching the horizon for something I could not name, but felt just the same. I carried my mother's telescope to the steps, its tripod legs clacking against the wood, and I set it up, though the sky showed no stars, only the dull silver promise that behind those clouds the moon waited, patient and unwavering. I did not mind. I liked the ritual of it, the slow, careful turning of screws, the delicate way I cleaned the lens with a scrap of cloth worn thin by years of fingerprints and dust. I thought of her hands doing this once, the same gentle circles, the same steady breath, as if each motion might coax some distant light to reveal itself more kindly. I wondered what she had seen, what questions she had asked in her own hush, when the house was asleep and the world shrank to the narrow eye of a glass tube. Maybe she too had asked the ocean for answers, or wondered if the light she gathered through this lens remembered touching her before drifting on to someone else's waiting eye. Sometimes I felt her here, in the soft creak of the porch, in the hush between waves, in the way the moon seemed to pause when I looked up, as if recognizing an old friend. Through my mother's hands, through my own, I lifted the telescope and aimed it not at the sky, but at the dune grass, where droplets clung like tiny worlds, each trembling in the soft breath of morning. There was wonder here too, in the small things, the hidden architecture of a blade of grass, the way the tiniest drop could hold the entire sky if you looked from the right angle. I thought how easy it was to forget this, to chase the farthest star and miss the miracle just beyond your porch rail. I focused the lens, turned the dial, until the image sharpened, each drop a perfect sphere glinting with a light that belonged to the rising sun and the lingering night. All at once, when I pulled back, the world seemed softer, edges blurred by the memory of looking closer than I usually dared. I sat there for a long time, sipping coffee now gone lukewarm, the tide sighing its endless story at my feet. I thought about tides of thought, how they come in slow, gentle at first, then stronger, filling the mind with questions that roll back only to return, new shaped by what they've touched since they left. I let my mind drift to the whales again, invisible in the deeps, but always present in the hush of salt and current. I imagined them passing beneath the waves, below the reach of my eyes, but not beyond the reach of my wonder. I thought of their songs, low and steady, echoing through salt dark, carrying maps and memories across miles of shifting water. Perhaps they too answered the moon in their way, lifting their massive heads toward its light as they surfaced to breathe. Perhaps they knew secrets I could never hold, not through glass, not through words, but only through this hush that binds us when we listen closely enough. I stayed like that until the sky brightened, the clouds peeling away to reveal strips of blue that glowed like veins through stone. I wondered if tonight the stars might show themselves again, if I might catch the moon in its quiet climb and ask it the questions I could never form in daylight. For now I packed the telescope away, careful as always, wrapping the lens in the same thin cloth, folding the tripod legs until they fit snug against its barrel. I carried it inside, leaned it in the corner by the old armchair where I kept my books and notebooks stacked like small islands of thought. I spent the afternoon walking the shore, the tide slipping away to reveal pale sand littered with kelp and shells broken open like secrets spilled by the sea. I bent to pick up a piece of driftwood worn smooth by its journey from some far shore to mine. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the grain, the soft edges where time and salt had erased its sharper truths. I slipped it into my pocket, a small reminder that everything drifts, everything returns. I thought about my footprints behind me already blurring as the water crept back up the sand, how even the memory of my passing would vanish under the next high tide. I found comfort in that too, this soft, undoing, this quiet promise that nothing stays exactly as it is, not even me. By evening the clouds had gathered again, but thinner now, torn in places to show the first shy stars blinking awake. I made my dinner by the light of the small lamp, a simple meal that tasted of salt and warmth, and the hush that settles when you eat alone, but not lonely. I kept the window open just enough to hear the sea, its slow conversation with the moon above. Sometimes I thought I heard other voices in that hush, scraps of old words, my mother's laugh, the echo of my own younger questions, but I let them drift through me like wind through dune grass not caught. Morning rose slow and gentle, as if it too had been awake all night listening to the sea's hush. I stepped out onto the porch before the sun had cleared the dunes, and stood with my hands tucked into my sleeves, watching the world breathe itself awake. The tide was already pulling back, leaving long mirrored streaks on the sand, where the sky repeated itself in blue and soft gray. A line of pelicans glided low over the water, their wings cutting the dawn, so quiet I could almost hear the feathers brush the air. Sometimes I thought about flight, not the hard physics of lift and drag, but the idea of trusting the air to hold you up the same way I trusted the hush to hold my thoughts. There was a time when I wanted to learn how to fly. I even took a lesson once, strapped into the narrow seat of a small plane that buzzed over fields and rooftops like a curious insect. I remember the feel of the yoke beneath my palms, the soft resistance as I tipped the nose slightly toward the horizon. My instructor's voice calm in my headset, telling me not to look straight down, but out, always out to where the sky met the land, where distance softened edges and made fear feel small. I think that was the first time I really understood how distance could be kind, how the farther you look, the softer things become. Maybe that is why I stand here now, peering past the waves, past the dunes, past the waking town and its sleepy windows, to where the moon still lingers faint in the west, its pale arc barely there, but enough I could feel it in my bones, the way you feel a memory just before it fully forms. I carried my coffee down to the sand today, the mug warm against my palms, grounding me as my feet sank into the cold, damp grit, tiny grains clinging to my soles, a reminder that even when you stand still, the earth holds you gently. I found a dry patch just above the high tide mark and settled there, cross-legged, staring out at the place where the sea turned into sky. The line was never sharp, always shifting, always blending, just as my thoughts did when I sat alone in the hush of this place. I wondered about edges, how we draw them to feel safe, to say here is ocean, here is sky, here am I. But the truth is there are no hard lines, only places where one thing becomes another, where salt becomes cloud, where light becomes memory, where the pull of the moon becomes the lift of the tide. I thought about the telescope back in the cabin, its lens waiting patiently for my hand to guide it skyward. I had carried it with me this morning, wrapped in a blanket to keep the salt mist from fogging the glass. I set it up slowly, careful not to rush the ritual, the tripod legs pressed into the sand, unsteady at first, then firm as I adjusted them. I liked the way it felt to build something steady in the shifting softness of the beach, a reminder that we can make anchors out of almost anything if we try. When I finally looked through the lens, the sun was too bright for stars, but I did not mind. Instead, I turned it toward the horizon, where the moon's ghost still lingered pale and thin against the blue, its edges blurred by the coming day. I studied its surface, tracing the familiar seas and scars, the dark patches where shadows lingered longer than light. I thought about how it never changes, yet always shifts, how the same face has turned toward us for eons, reflecting our curiosity back at us with a calm that never wavers. I wondered if the moon ever grew tired of our gaze, if it longed for a night without watchers, without questions. Maybe it did. Maybe that is why clouds come sometimes, not to block our view but to give the moon a moment to breathe unseen. When I lowered the telescope, the sun had climbed higher, painting the water with ripples of gold. The hush remained, though tucked beneath the sound of gentle waves and the distant call of gulls. I sipped my coffee, now cool to match the morning breeze, and thought about the pull again, how it is not only gravity, but memory too, how we are pulled by moments, by places, by the quiet weight of things unsaid. I remembered my mother's voice on nights when I could not sleep, how she would tell me the tide was like a promise that goes, but it always comes back. She said the same of dreams, that they drift away only to return when we are ready to carry them forward. I wondered if this place was a dream, returning, a piece of myself washing up like driftwood to be turned over in my hand, smoothed by time and thought, until I could see it clearly enough to let it go. I stayed on the beach until my legs grew stiff and the sun warmed the last of the morning chill from my shoulders. I packed the telescope carefully, brushing off the sand that clung to its legs, as if the beach wanted to keep a piece of it. When I returned to the cabin, I left the door open to let the sea breeze wander in, carrying with it the hush, the scent of salt, and possibility. I boiled water for more coffee, watched the steam curl and vanish into the light slanting through the window. I thought of the steam like the tide too. It rose, faded, drifted, and returned in cycles so soft we forget they are cycles at all. I sat at my small table, notebook open, pencil balanced across the page, still waiting for words. I traced my fingers over the blank lines, feeling the texture of the paper, as if the story were already there, hidden just beneath, waiting for me to listen. Instead of force, I wrote a single line: the tide listens to the moon, and we listen to the tide. It felt like enough for now. I closed the notebook, set it aside, and moved to the window where I could see the water glittering in the distance, a silver hush waiting to fold itself over the sand once more. I thought about the whales again, how their songs slip through salt and time, carrying stories that do not belong to any single moment, but to the whole vast hush. I thought about how maybe this is what I am doing here, gathering the hush, carrying it inside me until I am ready to sing it back in whatever way I can. For now, though I only listened, I leaned against the window frame, eyes soft on the shifting light, feeling the pull that never asks for more than my patience, and the quiet trust that whatever drifts away will find its way back on the next tide. Night returned without asking for permission, soft as breath slipping through the cracked window, while I sat by the table, tracing the rim of my mug with a fingertip, listening to the slow tick of the old clock on the wall. I had not bothered with the lamp tonight, letting the hush fold around me in shadows that stretched and settled like a cat finding its favorite corner. The ocean outside spoke its steady language, the same hush, the same pull, a constant reminder that somewhere beyond the dunes the moon waited, patient and watchful. It felt closer tonight, though I could not say why. Maybe it was the way the tide had come in higher than the night before, curling its salt breath closer to the foot of the dunes, as if testing how far it could reach. Or maybe it was the way the stars seemed sharper in the gaps between drifting clouds, each one a tiny question suspended above the hush. I rose from the table and lifted the telescope from its corner, careful of its weight, which always surprised me. Heavier than it looked, yet not heavy enough to hold down the thoughts that always drifted loose. When I peered through its lens, I stepped outside barefoot on the cool planks of the porch, each board a soft drum beneath my steps. The telescope found its place on the railing, steady enough though the breeze played at its legs. I leaned into the eyepiece, letting my breath go soft, so the glass would not fog. Stars scattered themselves in constellations I could name, but did not speak aloud. Names felt too sharp tonight, too certain. I preferred to let them remain as they were, flecks of light spilled across dark water, each carrying its own hush, its own echo of a beginning that existed long before my small questions. I drifted from star to star, letting the focus slip now and then to blur the edges into soft circles of promise. Sometimes I thought about the light itself, how what touched my eye had been born so long ago that the world had left behind no longer existed, how the sky above was not a roof, but a memory unfolding in slow layers. I wondered what it would feel like to ride that light backwards, slipping past the hush of the dunes, past the hush of my own heartbeat, into a place where time bent soft as the tide's edge. I pulled away for a moment, resting my elbows on the railing, listening to the hush wrap around the cabin, the tide slipping in and out of itself, just out of sight. I could almost believe that if I closed my eyes and leaned forward, the hush would lift me to carry me out over the dunes and the wet dark sand to where the water waited to trace my ankles with its cold question. I did not close my eyes, though not yet. Instead, I turned the telescope lower, following the slope of the dunes where shadows held small secrets, a fox maybe, or the quick whisper of a night bird testing the air for stories. The lens caught a flicker of movement, then nothing, a reminder that not everything wants to be seen. Some things belong to the hush alone. I wondered what the moon knew of these hidden moments, what secrets it kept folded in its pale light, secrets the ocean read with each tide, pulling them out to sea and bringing them back again. In the hush between waves, I stayed at the railing until my shoulders grew stiff, until the hush deepened into the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, the tide reaching its farthest point before retreating. I packed the telescope slowly, wiping the lens clean of my breath, my fingerprints, my questions. I carried it inside, set it gently in its corner, as if placing a sleeping child into bed. The clock ticked on, reminding me that night would not last forever, but for now it was enough. I made tea instead of coffee, letting the steam rise in soft curls that caught the moonlight through the window. I cupped my hands around the mug, feeling the warmth sink into my bones. I thought about my mother again, how she used to stand at the kitchen sink long after everyone else had gone to bed, the hush of her own small hours wrapping around her as she stared out the window at a yard gone silver under the same patient moon. I never asked her what she saw there. I only knew that when I woke to find her standing there, she would smile, soft and tired, and I would return to bed carrying that smile like a small lantern against the dark. I wondered what she would think of me here alone in this cabin at the edge of the hush, my thoughts wandering, tides tracing old questions she once held in her own quiet way. Maybe she would sit beside me at this table, wrap her hands around her own mug, and we would watch the steam rise together, not needing to speak, because some hushes do not want words. I finished my tea and rinsed the cup, setting it upside down in the sink to dry. I left the window cracked so the night could slip and bring its salt hush to settle in the corners where my questions liked to gather. I lay down on the small bed, the blankets cool against my skin, the hush filling the space between my heartbeat and the sound of the tide. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come right away. Instead, I let my mind drift over the dunes, the beach, the endless hush of the dark water, the moon somewhere above, not watching exactly but present as a slow promise. I thought about the pull again, not just the tide, but the gentle tug of all things moving toward each other in ways we rarely see, how the earth lifts slightly to meet the moon's touch, how light bends just enough to find my waiting eye, how the hush itself seems to lean closer when I remember to listen. I wondered what the whales might be singing tonight deep beneath the waves, if their notes stitched the hush tighter, if their low calls slipped between the stars to brush against the moon. I drifted in and out of that thought, my breathing matching the slow pull of the tide, my hands resting open on the blanket as if waiting for something to arrive, something soft and steady that asked for nothing but trust. One let the hush have me, then my thoughts rising and falling like the tide slipping back from shore, only to return with the next pull, a promise quiet and constant as the moon's own breath over water. I woke before the sun again, though this time it was not the tide or the hush that stirred me, but a dream, I could not quite hold on to the edges of it, slipped away like foam breaking on wet sand, leaving behind only the faint taste of salt and a sense that I had been somewhere deep and silent where questions did not need to be asked because everything had already answered itself. I lay there listening to the cabin breathe, the soft groan of wood settling, the faint tap of wind against the window, the hush of the ocean reaching me even here, folded into blankets still warm from sleep. I wondered if the dream had come from the sea or the moon or some old part of myself that only wakes when the rest of me drifts quiet enough to listen. When I could not hold still any longer, I slipped from the bed and padded barefoot across the cold floor. The morning air pressed against my skin, waking me more fully than any thought could. I made tea instead of coffee, craving something gentle to carry the hush forward into daylight. The steam rose around my face, carrying the scent of chamomile and something older, like a meadow hidden just behind the dunes. I wrapped myself in my thick sweater, pulled on boots, and stepped outside. The porch was damp with dew, tiny droplets clinging to the railing, catching the first shy light that bled through the clouds. The tide had fallen back, leaving the sand rippled and silvered in the early hush, as if the moon had brushed its fingers there. Before slipping behind the horizon, I walked down the narrow path through dune grass that swayed and hissed with each step. The sea waited ahead, its breath slow and steady. I stopped where the sand began, pulling my boots off so I could feel the cold grit cling to my feet, a small reminder that the earth likes to hold us even when we forget. I stood there for a long while, teacup warming my hands, the ocean stretching away in its endless hush. I thought about the pull again, about how it works in silence, how the moon never shouts its will, yet the water answers anyway, a quiet obedience, or maybe a quiet agreement. I wondered if there were other things inside me that answered a pull, just as soft thoughts. I had pushed away memories. I pretended not to carry all of it, tugged by something I could not name, but trusted just the same. I moved closer to the water, where the sand was dark and firm beneath my steps. I let the tide reach my toes, icy at first, then strangely welcome. I could feel the faint pulse of it against my ankles, the push and pull that never rests. Even when I look away somewhere far out, a line of birds lifted off the surface, rising together in a slow arc that bent toward the horizon. Their wings caught the pale light, their bodies seemed to hover just between here and there, a reminder that flight is only trust made visible. I closed my eyes and listened. The hush filled my chest, filled the small spaces between my ribs until it felt like part of my breath. I thought of the whales again, though I had never seen one. From this shore, I imagined them below the surface, moving through their dark corridors, trusting currents and songs more ancient than any word I knew. Maybe they too felt the moon's tug, maybe their huge hearts answered in ways I could not understand, but felt all the same. I wondered what they would think of me standing here at the edge of their world, tea cooling in my hands, bare feet pressed into their ocean skin, asking questions I never spoke aloud. Maybe they would remind me that not all questions want answers, some only want the hush that comes when we finally stop asking. I stayed until my feet numbed and the tide threatened to creep higher, pulling at the hem of my jeans. Like a child wanting to play, I turned back up the beach, carrying the cold grip between my toes as proof that I had let the ocean touch me today. When I reached the cabin, I set the empty cup by the door and brushed the sand from my feet, but not all of it. Some stayed, clinging stubborn as memory. I liked that small defiance, a reminder that the shore would always follow me inside, no matter how carefully I swept it away. I opened the notebook on my table, the pencil waiting across the blank page, like a bridge between what I knew and what I hoped to learn. I wrote slowly, the words coming like the tide, one by one, leaving spaces between them wide enough for the hush to breathe. I wrote about the dream. I could not remember how it felt, round and full, like a wave rolling under the surface just out of sight. I wrote About the birds, about the tea, about the way the ocean does not care if I stand at its edge or turn my back. It will keep moving, keep folding itself over the shore, keep answering the moon with its soft promise. I paused, often staring out the window, where the dune grass bent under the same wind that pressed against my thoughts. I thought about my mother again, her hands on the telescope, her quiet voice telling me the stars are not far, only old. I wondered if she had stood at her own window once, tea in hand, hush in her chest, asking the same silent questions I ask now. I wondered if this was her tide inside me, still rising, still falling. I wrote until the page was full, then I closed the notebook, not needing to read it back. Some words are not for reading, only for laying down, like footprints in wet sand meant to vanish. When the next wave comes, I moved to the porch and sat on the top step, letting the late morning sun find my face. The warmth slipped over my closed eyelids, turned the inside of my thoughts gold. I thought about the tide lines, the places on the sand that mark where the water once reached and would reach again. I thought about the pull, how we are all marked by it, whether we see it or not, the way the moon writes its secrets into our blood and bones, soft but certain. I sat there until the hush inside me matched the hush outside, and for a moment I felt no edge between them, just a quiet place where I could breathe and drift the way light drifts through space, carrying memory, carrying time, carrying the promise that everything comes home to the tide sooner or later. When dusk found me again, it arrived gently, no grand colors, no thunder of clouds, only a soft unwinding of light, like the final exhale of something ancient drifting away without needing to announce its leaving. I sat at the porch's edge, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the wooden planks still holding the day's warmth beneath my legs. The ocean was quieter tonight, or maybe I had grown better at hearing the hush behind its constant breath. The moon had not yet risen, but I felt it waiting just below the horizon, the same way you feel a word on your tongue before you speak it. I thought about how many nights I had spent here already, how each one seemed to fold itself into the next like waves rolling over waves until time blurred soft and forgiving. I wondered if the tide could remember each step I had taken along its edge, each question I had offered to the hush, and if so, whether it kept those moments somewhere deep beneath the surface, hidden among the drifting forests of kelp and the slow, steady songs of whales that crossed paths in the dark water. I wanted to believe it did, that nothing was ever really lost, only carried away and returned in another shape when we were ready to see it again. I thought of my notebook inside, resting on the table, its pages breathing quiet words into the hush. Even when closed, I liked to imagine the words settled there like small stones at the bottom of a clear pool, unmoved by the ripples above, yet touched by the moonlight that finds its way down through the water's skin. I let my eyes drift to where the dunes met the sky, their soft slopes darkening into shadows. The wind moved through the grass in slow sighs, sometimes lifting the blades so they caught the last scraps of light and shivered silver for a heartbeat, then settled again. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, my fingers tracing its edge as if it were a shoreline of its own. I thought about my mother's old quilts, how she would spread them across the bed in winter, each layer stitched from pieces of other things, old shirts, scraps of curtains, patterns that did not match, but somehow belonged together. Under her hands, those mismatched pieces became something that could hold warmth the way the ocean holds the moons pulled away. The hush holds my scattered thoughts. I wondered if she had ever sat wrapped in one of those quilts, listening to the tide somewhere far from here, asking her own questions into the hush that never answers out loud yet always listens. I stood and stepped down from the porch, boots crunching softly over the path of sand that led between the dunes. The air was cooler now, brushing my cheeks with a salt chill that felt like a promise. I carried the blanket with me, trailing its edge through the dry grass that lined the path. The ocean waited ahead, hidden by the rise and fall of dunes, but its hush grew clearer with every step I thought about the pull, how it never demands, yet never stops asking, how it gathers all that drifts away and gives it back piece by piece, shaped by distance and return. When I crested the last dune, the beach spread before me wide and pale in the fading light. The tide was low, stretching its dark mirror far out toward the horizon where the first stars began to prick the dusk. I stepped out of my boots, pressed my bare feet into the cool sand, feeling the grains shift and settle around my toes, a small reminder that we are always held even when we think we stand alone. I walked to where the wet sand gleamed under the deepening sky and sat wrapping the blanket around my knees, the hush folded around me a second skin. I watched the water slip in and out, tracing the shore with fingers that never tired. I thought about how the tide must feel to the moon, a quiet answer repeating itself in slow syllables, lifting and falling, carrying secrets from shore to shore. I closed my eyes and listened to the spaces between the waves where the hush grew wider, deeper, a place where thought loosened and drifted like driftwood carried by currents. I wondered if somewhere below the surface a whale sang a note that would take hours to reach another, or if perhaps it sang only for itself, a sound to mark its passing through the endless blue. I liked that thought, the idea that not every song needs a listener, that some notes exist simply to fold themselves into the hush, becoming part of the tide's secret language. When I opened my eyes, the moon had climbed a little higher now, a thin silver arc cresting the distant edge of water. Its light spilled across the wet sand, catching in the ripples like stars that had forgotten the sky. I rose then, stepping closer to where the tide breathed at my feet. The cold wash of it crept over my ankles, then retreated only to return again, a gentle insistence that felt almost like a hand taking mine. I thought about the telescope back at the cabin, how tomorrow I would carry it down here, set it on the sand, and point it not at the obvious light, but at the hidden spaces, the dark places between stars, where the faintest secrets drift just out of sight, waiting for a patient. I thought of my mother's voice again, how she would have reminded me to breathe slow, to trust that some questions are not solved but carried forward wave by wave, hush by hush. The moon climbed higher, its reflection breaking across the water in thin trembling lines. I stood there barefoot, wrapped in my blanket, feeling the tides pull through the soles of my feet, the hush weaving itself into my breath. I wondered what the ocean would remember of me when I was gone, whether my steps and questions and small soft songs would slip into its memory like sand into a shell, becoming something larger than themselves. I turned then, making my way back up the beach, each step a quiet promise to return, the blanket trailing behind me, catching bits of sand that clung to its edge, as if wanting to come too. When I reached the top of the dune, I paused, looking back at the line of water, at the moon's patient arc, at the hush that waited there, always ready to lift me the moment I was willing to drift again. I carried it with me back to the porch, back to the cabin, back to the quiet place where sleep waited, gentle as tide, ready to pull me under and carry me wherever the moon's slow breath wished me to go. I woke just before dawn to the softest rain tapping at the window, as if the sky itself had decided to join in the hush I had grown to know so well. I lay there for a moment, listening to the steady tick of droplets against the glass, feeling the weight of the blanket over my chest, the warmth of sleep still clinging to the edges of my mind. I thought about how the rain and the tide spoke the same language, how both arrived unhurried, answered the moon in different ways, yet carried the same soft promise of return. I rose without turning on the lamp, letting the early gray light guide me across the small room. My feet touched the cold floor, grounding me in the simple truth that sometimes the only thing that matters is feeling the earth beneath you, reminding you that you are here, awake, part of this quiet unfolding. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the sound of water heating a gentle echo of the rain outside. When the steam began to whisper, I poured it over tea leaves, watching them swirl and settle like tiny secrets unfolding in warm current. I carried the mug to the window and pressed my palm against the cool pane, tracing the path of a droplet as it meandered downward, leaving a clear trail through the misty glass. I wondered where each drop had come from, what sky, what cloud, what moment of the ocean's breath had lifted it into the air to drift so far, only to find its way here to my quiet cabin beside the dunes. I stepped outside, holding the mug close, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. The rain fell soft enough that it did not chase me back inside. Instead, it wrapped around me a fine veil that clung to my hair and eyelashes, and turned the dune grass silver in the half-light. I thought about the pull again, how even the rain answered it in its own way, drawn up from the sea by the sun, carried on winds across miles, only to fall back home to the waiting hush of the earth. I wondered if my own questions were like that, lifted by curiosity, carried across the wide sky of my mind, only to fall back into the hush each time I returned to this place. I sipped the tea, its warmth a small anchor against the chill. The tide was hidden from view, but I felt its presence as surely as the rain on my skin, the steady heartbeat beneath the dunes where my thoughts so often drifted when the world grew too sharp. I closed my eyes for a moment and let myself listen, not just to the rain, but to the hush beneath it, the sound the tide made even when I could not see it, the way the wind moved through the dune grass, the soft creak of the porch settling under my weight, all of it layered together like waves folding over each other, gentle, relentless, inevitable. I thought about bringing the telescope out into the rain, but knew better. The lens would fog the glass, would collect droplets that blurred instead of clarified, so I let it rest inside its corner by the chair, waiting for clearer skies, knowing the stars would keep their secrets a little longer. Sometimes it felt right not to look too closely, to let the hush hold its mysteries without demanding they show themselves all at once. I sat on the porch steps, the mug warm in my hands, the blanket from the night before draped over my shoulders, catching stray drops that slipped from the eaves. I watched the sky lighten by slow degrees, the deep gray softening at the edges where the first hints of dawn pressed through. I thought about light again, how it moves through time, carrying old stories to new eyes, how each wave of it is both present and past, how when I look at the moon I see it not as it is but as it was moments ago, a small reminder that distance does not erase connection, it only changes the way we see it. I wondered what light carried my own questions across the hush, what quiet beams slipped from my eyes into the night, only to return as dreams I could not hold. When morning came, I breathed in the rain, let it fill my chest with the clean promise of small beginnings. I wondered if the tide felt the rain when it fell, if each drop was noticed, folded into the salt, the hush, the endless rolling promise of return. I imagined the whales far below the surface, moving through their dark corridors, singing notes that curved through water and rain, like a low sound that might find me here if I listened long enough. I wondered if they ever rose close enough to feel the tap of rain on their backs, if they turned their great heads skyward to greet it as a cousin of the tide. I stayed like that until the rain eased, until the sky opened in soft streaks of blue that promised the day would stretch itself slowly, unrushed, like the tide pulling away from shore, only to come back later with new secrets to share. I stood, brushed the damp from my blanket, and carried the empty mug inside, setting it carefully in the sink where small traces of tea curled in the bottom, like the last lines of a quiet poem. I opened my notebook, laid it flat on the table, the pencil waiting across the blank page. I did not write right away. Instead, I traced my finger along the grain of the paper, feeling its rough promise, the small ridges that caught the light when I turned it, just so. I thought about how words are like the tide too, how they come in slow, hesitant, sometimes retreating before they are ready to stand on the shore of the page. I waited, listening to the hush inside me, the soft pull of thoughts that had not yet formed. When they came, they did so gently, like the rain that had tapped my window at dawn. I wrote about the water that lifts itself only to fall again, the secret promise hidden in every drop, the quiet hush that holds it all together. I did not worry about making sense, only about letting the tide of words reach the page in its own time. When I finished, I set the pencil down and closed the notebook, its cover warm from my touch. I stepped back outside, the sky now brightening, the rain a memory caught in droplets that clung to the dune grass, sparkling in the first light. I thought about the moon, still there though hidden by the sun's arrival, how its pull remained steady, invisible but certain, guiding the tides, guiding my own quiet drift through questions and hush and dreams I could not keep. I breathed the salt air, felt the wet sand still clinging to my steps from the night before, and trusted that like the rain, like the tide, like the light, my small questions would find their way home, carried by the hush, returned by the patient pull that waits beyond every wave. By the time the sun had risen fully, the last traces of rain had slipped away, leaving behind a sky so clear it felt like glass stretched tight over the dunes and the ocean that murmured beyond them. I stepped outside with bare feet on the cool porch boards, feeling the warmth gather slowly under my soles. As the day opened itself without hurry, I carried my mother's telescope with me, this time its weight familiar now, as if it had taken on the shape of my palms. The tripod legs left faint trails in the sand as I walked toward the edge of the dune, where the grass bent low in the morning breeze, each blade glinting with drops that caught the sun like tiny stars. I paused at the crest for a moment, feeling the hush that always settled over this place stronger now, as the tide pushed its slow breath against the wide curve of the shore below. I thought about how long I had been here, how each day folded itself softly into the next, like the tide pulling itself into a wave only to fall and rise again. I wondered if the ocean noticed me, the small figure returning to its edge day after day, with the same questions tucked into pockets. I set up the telescope at the top of the dune, where the sand was firm enough to hold the tripod steady. I pointed it not at the sea, but at the line, where the sky dipped low over the water, a pale line that shimmered with the promise of distance and hidden drift. I liked to think that looking at the horizon through glass changed it somehow, turned it into something more than an edge, something deeper, like the hush itself made visible. I pressed my eye to the lens and let the focus drift until the line blurred into soft colors, blue and silver, and hints of cloud that stretched themselves thin across the vast hush. I wondered what light might cross that line today, which secrets might drift from sun to sea to me. As I waited, my breath fogged the lens for a moment, and I pulled back, letting the glass clear while I watched a gull wheel overhead, its wings cutting the sky into pieces that rejoined the moment it passed through. I thought about flight again, about how the bird trusted the air to hold it up, how each tilt of a feather was an answer to the invisible currents that lifted and pulled it forward. I envied the trust sometimes, how simple it seemed to let the wind decide the next shape of your path. I bent back to the telescope, this time turning it slightly to follow the slow arc of a cloud that drifted alone across the open sky. I traced its edges soft as breath, wondering how many drops of the rain that fell this morning still hid inside that shape, carried upward only to fall again somewhere I would never see. I liked knowing that the rain and I shared a path for a moment, that its hush had touched my window, my skin, before moving on to touch something else, maybe the ocean itself, waiting patiently to gather those drops into its salt memory. I stayed like that for a long time, shifting the focus, letting the glass hold pieces of sky for me, pieces I could not hold alone. I thought of my mother's voice telling me that the stars we see are old light, how each flicker is a memory reaching forward through time to remind us that nothing is ever truly gone, only changed, carried, reshaped by distance. I wondered what my own light might look like if I could see it trailing behind me, folding into the hush the way waves fold into each other at the edge of the tide. When I finally lowered the telescope, the sun had climbed high enough to make the sand warm under my toes. I packed the glass away, careful with each piece, each latch, each strap that bound it together. I liked the ritual, the small promise that tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the hush asked me, I could carry it back here and open the sky again. I carried the telescope back to the cabin, letting the dune grass brush my legs, the small seeds clinging to my pants as if wanting to travel with me. When I stepped inside, the hush came to, settling in, the corners filling the spaces between the ticking of the clock and the soft creak of the floor. I made tea again, watching the water swirl and steam, feeling the simple comfort of warmth in my palms. I sat by the window with my notebook open, the pencil resting against the margin, waiting for whatever drifted through the hush to find its way into words. I did not rush. I let my breath slow to match the tide. I could not see, but felt inside my ribs. I wrote about the bird, the cloud, the rain. I wrote about the line between sea and sky, how it was never fixed, always drifting like thought itself. I wrote about how sometimes the things we look for through glass or tide or night are not answers, but invitations to stand quietly at the edge and listen. When the word stopped, I closed the book, tracing my fingertips over the cover as if sealing the hush inside. I set the notebook aside and stepped back onto the porch, where the sun had turned the boards warm enough to remind me that I belonged here just as much as the tide did, just as much as the moon that waited beyond the day's bright dome. I sat there, feeling the salt air slip through my hair, brush my cheek. Like a slow thought, I wondered about the whales again, how their songs moved through salt dark, touching things I would never see, how their low notes folded into the hush like stones dropped into deep water, sending ripples that drifted out and out, never asking for return. I liked believing that part of me drifted with them, that my small questions might ride those hidden currents down through the hush, returning someday as dreams I would wake to without fully understanding. I watched the dunes bend and sway, the ocean's breath brushing through them, a reminder that nothing here is still, not the sand, not the grass, not the hush that ties them all together. When the tide reached high again, I would walk the line where water meets shore, press my feet into the cold wet sand, feel the pull that never asks yet never lets go. I would stand there long enough for the moon to find me, its pale arc waiting just beyond sunset, ready to lift the ocean once more, ready to lift my thoughts once more, ready to remind me that the hush is not empty, but full of every promise the tide has ever made to the moon, and every promise the moon has ever whispered back. I woke to a sky so clear it seemed to ring like glass over the dunes, and the hush felt deeper somehow, as if the world had paused between breaths just long enough for me to notice the difference before the tide turned back inward again. I sat at the edge of the bed, feet pressed to the cool wooden floor, listening to the hush settle itself in the corners of the small room, where shadows clung like soft thoughts waiting to be named. I thought about the moon, though I could not see it yet, how its pull never wavered even when hidden by daylight, how it moved through my waking and sleeping both, like a question I had asked long ago, but could not remember the answer to. I dressed slowly, pulling the sweater over my shoulders, the sleeves too long, brushing my knuckles in a way that made me feel held somehow. The kettle whistled in its quiet way, the steam drifting toward the cracked window, where the morning light pooled across the sill. I poured the tea and carried it outside, feeling the heat of the cup press into my palms, like a small reminder that I was here, awake, part of the hush, whether I understood it or not. I walked down the narrow path through dune grass that brushed against my knees, leaving traces of dew that clung to the hem of my pants. The ocean was not yet visible, but its voice reached me just the same, soft and steady, lifting itself over the ridge of sand the same way it had for as long as I had stood here asking silent questions. I liked to think the tide knew me now, that it recognized the shape of my footsteps, the weight of my thoughts, the way my breath caught each time I stepped onto the sand, and felt the hush slip inside my ribs. I paused at the top of the dune, tea balanced in one hand, watching the water slide itself over the shore in slow arcs that caught the sun and scattered it back in shivers of gold. I thought of my mother then, how she might have stood in her own quiet place somewhere far from here, cup in hand, watching the same tide carry the same hush to her feet. I wondered what questions she held, what small promises she whispered to the moon when no one else could hear them. I stepped down onto the beach, the sand cold and damp under my feet, grains sticking between my toes, a small anchor to remind me that the earth always wants to hold us, no matter how far our thoughts drift. I walked until the tea cooled in my hands, and the sun climbed higher, softening the sharp edge of the dawn into something I could fold myself into without fear. The tide had reached its far point, now resting before it turned back to gather itself again. I stood at its edge, letting the water curl around my ankles, the chill so clean it made my heart open wider than I knew it could. I thought about the pull, how it works in silence, how the moon never needs to speak to lift this entire ocean, and how the ocean never argues, only rises, answers, returns. Always I lifted my eyes to where the sky bent over the horizon, a line so thin it looked like it could break under the weight of my gaze. I wondered what lived out there beyond what I could see, what slow creatures moved beneath the waves, what songs folded themselves into currents too deep for my ears. I thought of the whales again, their voices stitched into the hush so far below my feet that only the tide itself could carry their notes back to me. I liked to believe they sang for the moon too, that their low songs lifted toward the surface each time the pull reminded them they were never alone. I turned back toward the dunes, leaving my footprints to be swallowed by the next wave, a soft erasing that felt kinder than forgetting. I liked how the tide made no promise to hold my steps forever, only to carry them for a while, then return the sand clean and waiting for my next questions. When I reached the cabin, I set the empty cup by the door and brushed the grit from my soles, though I knew it would cling to my skin until I let the tide have it again. Inside, the hush felt thicker than before, like a blanket draped over my shoulders. I welcomed it, carrying it with me to the small table where my notebook waited, the pencil balanced across its cover like a bridge. I opened the book, letting the last words breathe up at me, faint lines that traced the hush into something I could almost speak. I set the pencil to the page and paused, listening for the tide inside my chest, the small pull that asked nothing but trust. The words came slowly, each one shaped by the hush that pressed itself against the window, the walls, the quiet spaces between the tick of the clock. I wrote about the tide and the pull, about how the moon never shows its hand but always keeps its promise, how the hush is not emptiness but a cradle for every drifted thought. I wrote about my mother, about the way her voice felt like water slipping between stones, how it carried my questions when I was too young to shape them myself, how it lifted me then the same way the tide lifts the shore, piece by piece, word by word. I closed the notebook when the page was full, breathing in the hush that lingered in the room, as if the tide itself had folded its salt breath into the grain of the wood. I stepped back onto the porch, telescope in hand, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm like an old truth. I carried it down the path through the dune grass to where the sand opened wide beneath the noon sun, the tripod legs pressed deep into the grit, holding steady as I lifted the lens skyward, not to the sun of course, but to the edge of the blue where faint clouds drifted like soft thoughts escaping the mind. I traced their shapes through the glass, watching them stretch and unravel over the hush that lay between me and the horizon. I thought about distance, how it is not always measured in miles, but in memory, how sometimes the farthest places live inside us, waiting for the hush to open the door. I wondered what my mother might have seen through this same lens if she had turned it not to the moon, but to the spaces where the sky lets slip its secrets. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun press against my lids, a soft gold that flickered like light on water. When I opened them again, the tide had begun its return, the hush lifting with it a promise that no edge is ever final, no question too far for the pull to find. I packed the telescope away, brushing the sand from its legs, feeling the grain slip through my fingers like hours. I carried it back to the porch where the hush waited, where the quiet inside me matched the quiet outside, a tide in its own way, a promise waiting to be lifted once more by the moon's patient hand. The hush lingered through the afternoon, like a thin veil stretched over everything I touched, as if the world had decided to move slower just for me, each sound softened by the tide's promise that nothing ever stays exactly where you left it, not even silence. I sat by the open window, listening to the dune grass shift and whisper beneath the weight of the wind, each blade bending and rising, as if it too remembered what it meant to answer a pull that asks nothing but patience. The ocean lay hidden just beyond my sight, but I felt it there, pressing its hush through the open window in salt threads that wove themselves through my breath. I could almost hear the water folding over itself, carrying questions from shore to shore, small secrets tumbling beneath the surface where light can only guess what lives below. I thought about how many nights I had stood at this window, notebook balanced on my knees, pencil scratching lines that barely held the tide inside them, how every word I wrote felt like dropping a pebble into deep water, the ripples slipping outward until they vanished into something larger than my reach. I liked that feeling, the knowing that my small thoughts could drift past me, carried by the hush, to places I might never see. I closed the notebook for now, setting it beside the chair where the telescope waited, like an old friend dozing between stories. I reached for it, then feeling the familiar weight settle into my palms, the smooth chill of the barrel, the tripod legs folded tight against its side, I stepped outside with it and walked the same narrow path through the dunes, my feet tracing the curve of the land the way the tide traces the shore, one soft step at a time. I paused at the crest where the sand dipped down toward the beach. The ocean stretched wide before me, a sheen of light trembling at its surface, the tide halfway home, its breath lifting tiny curls of foam that caught the sun and flicked it back in glances. I liked to think the ocean and the sky talked to each other in those moments, trading secrets and glimmers too bright for the eye to hold for long. I set the telescope down, pressing its legs deep into the sand to anchor it against the wind that tugged at my sleeves. I lifted the barrel and let it rest on my shoulder for a moment, feeling its quiet readiness, the way it asked nothing of me but time. I turned it skyward, searching for that thin line where the last scraps of day folded into the hush of coming night, the first faint stars beginning to find their places, scattered like notes on a sheet of music written in a language older than my questions, older even than the tide. I found a bright point near the horizon, a planet, maybe one of those steady wanderers whose path bent gently around the sun, like a thought drifting through the hush. I watched its small light pulse and settle, then slip behind a passing cloud that drifted by like a slow breath. I thought of my mother again, how her voice would wrap around my questions soft as dusk, how she would remind me that the light I see now left that place long before I opened my eyes to it, how the hush of the sky carries old stories if only I stand still enough to listen. I turned the telescope slightly, searching for the curve of the moon, but it had not yet climbed high enough to show itself, content to wait just below the edge of the world until darkness spread its arms wide enough to hold it. I liked that about the moon, how it did not hurry, how it trusted the tide to mark its promise, how the ocean rose to greet it every night with the same hush, the same breath. I lowered the telescope and let my eyes trace the waves instead, watching how they lifted themselves up only to fall again, a quiet surrender that never lost its shape. I thought about how much of this place I carried inside me, how even when I packed the telescope away, when I stepped back inside the cabin, the hush slipped into my pockets, into the folds of my sleeves, into the quiet curve of my spine. I thought about how my Mother's hush lived in me too, tucked between my ribs, where her voice once hummed stories about tides and stars. And the way light never really leaves, it just keeps moving, looking for someone patient enough to notice. I stayed on the beach until the wind grew sharper, until the first clear edge of the moon lifted itself above the dark line of water, its light turning the wet sand into a mirror where my own shape wavered softer than a thought. I stepped closer, letting the tide touch my ankles, the cold push and pull of it folding over my feet, and slipping back out to sea. I wondered how many times I had stood here like this, asking the same quiet questions, trusting the same quiet answers. I thought of the whales deep below the surface, where the moon's light barely reaches, how they move through salt corridors, singing low songs that bend around the hush and carry my secrets to places my feet will never touch. I liked that thought, that part of me drifted so far beyond what I could see, that somewhere in the dark the hush grew wider because of it. I packed the telescope away, carefully brushing sand from its legs, feeling each grain slip through my fingers, like tiny hours passing unnoticed, yet still there, marking time in soft hushes. I walked back through the dunes, the moon rising higher behind me, its pull a soft thread stitched through my shoulders, through the hush, through the tide that kept lifting and falling with every step I took. When I reached the cabin, I set the telescope in its corner by the window, its lens still warm from my touch. I made tea again, waiting for the water to swirl and sigh into steam, the hush pressing in around me like a blanket draped over my shoulders. I carried the cup to the window and stood there, watching the moonlight spread itself across the dunes and the sandy ocean's breath slipping through the open crack in the glass, touching my face with salt and promise. I sipped the tea slowly, tasting the warmth, tasting the hush. I thought about tomorrow, how the tide would rise again, how the moon would wait for me in its own soft way, how the hush would hold my questions just as it always had, patient as light drifting through water. I let the steam blur my reflection on the glass, and behind it the night folded itself over the cabin, over the dunes, over the endless hush that waited for me just beyond the tide's reach, ready to lift me when I was ready to drift. Sleep found me in fragments that night, drifting in and out like the tide itself. Sometimes I surfaced in the dark, feeling the hush wrap around my shoulders. Other times I sank below it, where thoughts floated soft and formless, carried by currents I could not name. I dreamed of the ocean, though when I woke I could not remember its shape, only the feeling of salt on my tongue and the quiet certainty that something vast had moved beneath me unseen. When the morning finally arrived, it slipped through the window, slow and silver, softening the edges of the room so that even the familiar shape of the telescope resting in its corner looked new. I sat up and listened to the hush breathing through the walls, through the floorboards, through the thin seam of the door where cool air slipped in, carrying the scent of the dunes and the sea beyond them. I stood barefoot, feeling the chill press into my skin until I was awake enough to carry it with me. I made tea, letting the water warm my hands before I stepped outside onto the porch. The sky above was low, with pale clouds drifting like slow thoughts across the hush. No sharp edges, no bright sun, only that wide soft light that made the sand and grass below glow as if lit from within. I carried the cup down the path between the dunes, feeling the wet grit of the sand cling to my soles with each step, a quiet reminder that this place knew me now, that it would not let me pass without leaving part of itself behind. The tide was halfway home again, pulling back from the shore, but not entirely gone, its breath still folding over the sand in slow murmurs that matched the hush inside my chest. I stopped where the damp sand met the dry and stood there, letting the wind slip through my hair, letting the hush speak its wordless promise that the pull would always be there as long as I was willing to listen. I thought of my mother, then her quiet voice threading through my memory like a soft tide, how she would stand at the window back home, one hand resting on the glass while the other traced the rim of her cup the same way I did now. I wondered if she too felt the moon's pull in the hush of her own small hours, if she trusted it to carry her questions where words could not. I knelt, and set the cup in the sand, watching steam lift and vanish into the morning air, a small offering to the tide, to the moon, to the hush that had kept me company longer than I had realized. I pressed my palm into the wet sand beside it, feeling the earth take my weight, feeling the hush rise through my skin like the breath of something ancient and kind. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening not for answers, but for the spaces between the tide's whispers, the quiet places where my thoughts settled like grains of salt waiting to be carried somewhere new. When I opened my eyes, the cup was still there, the steam gone, the tide still lifting and falling at the edge of my vision, unchanged, and yet never the same. I picked it up and rose, brushing sand from my knees, though some clung stubborn as memory. I liked how this place refused to stay only outside of me, how it found its way into the cuffs of my pants, the creases of my palms, the hush folding itself into the smallest corners of my day. I carried the cup back to the cabin, the path through the dunes bending slightly under the wind that moved the grass in long gentle waves, each blade answering the same pull in its own quiet way. Inside, I set the cup in the sink and opened the notebook at the table, the pencil waiting, its point resting in the margin, as if it too had paused to listen. I did not write at once. Instead, I let my fingers drift over the page, tracing the faint grooves left by older lines, words I could barely see, but felt all the same. I wondered how many questions had passed through this paper, how many secrets the hush had carried into my hands without my knowing. I wrote about the tide today, about how it retreats, not in fear, but in trust, knowing it will return stronger, fuller, ready to touch the shore again. I wrote about the pull, about how we pretend we do not feel it, yet find ourselves moving in circles, drawn back to places that know us even when we forget their shape. I wrote about my mother and the quiet room where she once watched the moon climb over rooftops and trees, letting its silver hush slip into her bones the way it slips into mine. I paused, often lifting my eyes to the window where the dunes leaned into the sky, bending but never breaking under the soft press of the wind. When the page was full, I closed the book and set the pencil across its cover like a bridge between what I knew and what I would come to know. When I was ready to ask again, I pulled on my sweater and lifted the telescope from its corner, the weight of it grounding me, the cold barrel pressing into my palm, a small promise that what I could not see today would wait for me tomorrow. I stepped outside again, feeling the sky above shift, as if the hush itself leaned closer to hear where I would point my questions. I carried the telescope down to the beach, this time walking past the damp line where the tide had marked its last breath, the sand firmer here, cool against my soles. I set the tripod down, pressed its legs deep into the wet grit so the wind would not steal its balance. I lifted the barrel and aimed it not at the low pale sky, but at the thin dark line where the ocean met it, a line that had never looked the same twice, no matter how often I searched its edges. I pressed my eye to the lens, letting the world narrow to that small circle of possibility inside the glass. The horizon trembled, soft and uncertain, the hush folding around it like a secret I was not meant to keep. I thought about how the ocean and the sky touched there, how the moon's pull curved over all of it, bending tides and clouds, and the quiet ache inside my ribs into something that asked nothing but my patience. I stayed like that for a long while, letting the hush settle my breath, letting the tide slip closer behind me, its voice steady, its promise unchanged. When I finally lowered the telescope, the world felt larger, not because it had shifted, but because I packed the glass away, brushing sand from its legs, the grains sticking to my fingertips like salt. I liked how the hush always left a trace, even when I turned my back to it. I walked back through the dunes, the path soft beneath my feet, the sky opening above me wide enough to hold every question I had yet to speak. The cabin waited at its door, opened the hush waiting too steady, as the tide ready to lift me again, when the moon rose, and the ocean breathed my name back into the sand. The afternoon unfolded itself without rush, each hour slipping into the next like the tide folding over sand that never argues, only waits for its next breath. I sat by the window, the old chair creaking softly beneath my weight, the notebook open on my knees, though the pencil rested still across the page. A thin line of sunlight slipped through the glass, painting the wood floor in gold. I traced that line with my bare foot, letting the warmth settle into my skin while I listened to the wind press against the cabin walls, a gentle insistence that the world beyond my thoughts kept moving even when I did not. I thought about how many days I had watched pass through this small frame of wood and glass, how each sky seemed to carry its own hush, some bright and sharp, some low and soft, like today, where clouds move slow enough to remind me that time does not always measure itself by the ticking of the clock, but by the shape of the light, by the sound of the tide, by the pull that drifts through bone and memory, asking nothing but my trust. One closed the notebook for now and rose from the chair, letting my feet find the cold floor. My sweater hung loose over my shoulders, sleeves trailing my wrists like forgotten thoughts. I liked the way fabric softened against skin in the hush of a day half turned toward dusk. I stepped outside, the door swinging open on its old hinges, letting the wind find my hair and lift it off my neck. The dunes before me leaned under the weight of the breeze, each blade of grass a small compass pointing somewhere I could not see, but felt just the same. I walked without the telescope today, leaving it by the window where its glass could rest, its weight held by the promise that the sky would wait for me whether I searched it tonight or not. My feet found the path between the dunes, the sand cool beneath each step, the small grains clinging to my arches, my toes reminders that the earth likes to hold us in quiet ways. I reached the crest where the view opened wide, the tide pressed far back now, leaving a flat plain of dark sand that mirrored the low clouds above it. The ocean's breast, softer here, but steady enough that I heard it slip over itself, carrying secrets and slow murmurs that matched the hush inside my chest. I thought of my mother's voice, how sometimes in memory it came to me not as words, but as a feeling, a warmth across my shoulders, a hush against my ear telling me that the pull was nothing to fear, that the tide knew my name long before I learned to speak it. I stepped down the dune, my boots sinking into the soft slope, the grass brushing my thighs, whispering its own small stories. As I passed, I reached the wet sand, my reflection stretched thin in the shallow pools left behind by the retreating water. I liked how the sky repeated itself there, how my shape blurred at the edges, made softer by the tide's quiet work. I bent and pressed my palm into one of those pools, watching the ripples break the sky into pieces that gathered themselves again as soon as my hand lifted. I thought about how questions do that too, how they break and return, never quite the same, but always part of the same hush. I stood and walked the line where the tide had paused, its breath faint at my ankles, the foam gathering around my boots, then slipping away, leaving behind salt traces that would cling until I returned to the cabin. I paused where a drift of kelp lay tangled with broken shells, each piece a small reminder that the ocean gives and takes without apology. I crouched and picked up a piece of shell, turning it over in my fingers, the edges worn smooth by water and time, the inside still pearled with a soft sheen. I slipped it into my pocket, not to keep forever, but to carry back to the cabin. A hush made solid enough to sit on my shelf beside the notebooks and the glass. The wind shifted, then carrying a chill that lifted goosebumps along my arms. I stood and lifted my face to it, closing my eyes, letting the salt sting my lashes. I thought of the whales again, how deep below they moved without seeing the moon, yet always feeling its pull, how their songs folded into currents that slipped through darkness and found each other in ways we could only guess. I wondered if the tide carried my questions to them, if my silent thoughts drifted through salt corridors until they brushed against something larger than I could hold. I stayed like that for a while, the hush pressing in around my shoulders, the sky darkening just enough to remind me that dusk was near, that the moon would lift itself soon into the same hush that lifted me. I turned back toward the dunes, each step leaving a soft print that the next wave would find and fold back into the sand. I liked how nothing here lasted unchanged, how the tide made room for new steps, new questions, new hushes to gather like driftwood on the shore. When I reached the cabin, the wind pushed the door open ahead of me, as if to say, "Welcome back, you are never really gone." I stepped inside, set the shell on the table beside my notebook, and brushed sand from my cuffs. The hush filled the corners of the room, carrying the scent of salt and wind, and the quiet promise that the tide was not finished speaking. I made tea again, the kettle's hiss a soft answer to the wind that tapped against the glass. I carried the cup to the window, watched the first thin edge of the moon lift itself above the dunes, silver and certain against the darkening sky. I thought of my mother again, how she might have stood at her own window, watching the same moon rise, carrying her thoughts in the hush of her breath, trusting the pull to gather them and return them when she was ready. I sat by the window, my fingers wrapped around the warm curve of the cup, my breath fogging the glass in small circles that faded as soon as they formed. I wondered if this was what it meant to belong not to the cabin or the dunes or the tide alone, but to the hush that ties them all together, the pull that never shouts, yet never lets go. I sipped the tea, let its warmth slip through me, the hush pressing deeper into the spaces between my heartbeat and my questions. I thought about tomorrow, how the tide would find the shore again, how the moon would lift the water, how I would stand at the edge of it all once more, letting the hush carry my questions back to the ocean, trusting that each wave would return with answers shaped not in words, but in the soft promise that nothing is ever truly lost, only carried forward, piece by piece, breath by breath, hush by hush. The moon climbed higher as the hours turned themselves over, quiet as a page turning in the dark, and I watched it from the porch, blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the cup of tea gone cold beside me, the hush slipping deeper into my bones with each slow breath. The tide was too far now to hear clearly, but I felt it all the same way. I felt my heartbeat steady beneath my ribs, answering some ancient rhythm I would never fully name. The wind pressed against my cheek, bringing with it the salt scent of the dunes and the whisper of grass bowing beneath its touch. I thought about how many nights had passed like this, my thoughts drifting wide and soft as the clouds that sometimes hid the moon's patient face, and I wondered how many nights remained, how many tides would lift and fall while I sat here watching shadows fold themselves over the sand. I thought of my mother again, and the small, half-forgotten stories she would share when I was too young to understand, how each one was a hush in disguise, a promise that the world is more than its edges, that the pull we feel inside is not something to fight, but something to follow. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening not to the wind or the tide, but to the quiet underneath, the quiet, the place where thought goes when it needs to rest, where memory settles like silt on the ocean floor, waiting for the right current to lift it again. I could almost hear her voice there, soft and steady, telling me about the moon's slow waltz around us, about how its gravity is not a force to command, but a gentle tug that makes the ocean breathe. I wondered if she had known even then that her own voice would become that same kind of pull for me, that it would rise in the hush between my waking and my dreams, carrying questions I no longer needed to shape in words. I opened my eyes again and looked down the path that wound through the dunes, its pale shape lit silver by the moon, as if it too were a tide folding through the grass. I rose and stepped off the porch, blanket still wrapped around my shoulders, my feet bare on the cool wood, then on the colder sand, the grains clinging to my soles like reminders that this place would not let me pass unnoticed. I liked the small insistence of it, the way the hush found its way under my skin without ever asking permission. I reached the crest of the dunes, where the ocean opened wide below. The tide had slipped back in quiet and slow, its breath folding over the shore in dark shining arcs that caught the moonlight and broke it into pieces too small to hold. I stood there feeling the pull in my shoulders, in my throat, in the soft place behind my ribs where my mother's voice still waited patient as the tide. I thought about the whales again, moving beneath that dark surface, their low songs slipping through soft corridors older than any map I could draw. I wondered if they felt the moon's hush pressing against their wide ribs, if they knew that every rise to the surface, every breath taken under stars was an answer to a question that never needed to be spoken. I stepped down the dune, my blanket trailing behind me, brushing the tops of the grass that bent to let me pass. I reached the line where the wet sand gleamed under the moon's careful watch, where the tide reached for my toes, then slipped back, leaving behind cold traces that faded as soon as they formed. I pressed my feet into that line, feeling the water pull heat from my skin, leaving behind the small ache that reminded me I was here, alive, part of this hush. Whether I understood it or not, I thought about my mother's telescope sitting by the window in the cabin, its lens dark now, its glass holding the memory of all the distant lights I had gathered through it. I wondered if tomorrow I might bring it here to the edge of the tide, let it drink the hush straight from the horizon, the way the ocean drinks the moon's pull. I liked the thought of it, the glass filled with the hush instead of just light, a reminder that sometimes the things we reach for are not so far when we let ourselves drift. I walked a little farther, letting the tide wash over my ankles, the cold bite of it steadying my breath, each wave a quiet promise that the ocean never forgets the shape of the shore even when it pulls away. I thought about the footprints I left behind, how the next wave would find them, erase them, press the sand smooth again, ready for my return. I liked how the tide held no grudge, no memory of what had come before, only the promise that it would rise again, that it would lift whatever I left behind and carry it out to where the whales sing their songs to the moon. I turned back when my legs began to ache from the cold, the blanket heavy with damp at the hem brushing the tops of my feet. As I climbed the dune once more, I paused at the crest, looking back at the water where the moon's light stretched itself thin over the dark waves. I breathed deep, filling my chest with salt and hush and the quiet warmth that comes when you know you are exactly where you should be. I stepped back down the path through the grass that whispered against my ankles, back to the porch where the cold cup of tea waited untouched by the hush, but part of it all the same. I set the blanket aside and lifted the cup, the porcelain cool now against my palms, but still carrying the shape of my hands. I like that too, the way warmth lingers even when it is gone, the way hush lingers even when the tide pulls back. I stood there for a long moment, letting the wind press against my back, the hush settle into my spine, the moon hang above me steady as breath. I thought about tomorrow and the day after, how the tide would find the shore again, how my footprints would return and vanish, how the telescope would rest its glass against the sky, gathering hush in shapes I had not yet learned to name. I thought about how my mother's voice would keep rising in the spaces between the hush and the tide, reminding me that this pull is not a burden, but a gift, that the ocean's breath is not a secret, but a song waiting for someone to stand still enough to listen. I stepped inside, leaving the door cracked so the hush could slip in behind me, filling the small cabin with the same salt promise that tomorrow the moon would lift the ocean again, and I would stand where the wet sand gleamed, waiting for the tide to breathe my name into the hush once more. When I woke, the hush was already there, waiting for me like a soft hand on my shoulder, reminding me before my eyes even opened that the tide had turned again, and the moon's quiet pull had done its work through the night. The light in the room was the color of old paper, soft and gold at the edges where it slipped through the curtain and spilled itself across the floorboards. I lay there for a while, listening to the cabin settle, to the faint hum of wind through the dune grass, to the whisper of the See too far to see, but never too far to feel. I thought about how many mornings had begun this way, with me half awake, half drifting in that place where the hush is thickest, where questions do not yet take shape, but hover instead like salt mist waiting for the sun to lift them. I thought about my mother again, and how I used to find her sitting at the edge of my bed before dawn, her hand resting lightly on my arm, her eyes distant in the half-dark, as if she too was listening for something that lived beyond the walls of our small house, some old hush that belonged to both of us long before we knew how to name it. I rose and dressed slowly, letting the chill of the floor wake my feet as I moved through the small space. The kettle hissed and clattered just as it always did, the steam carrying the hush in small invisible currents that slipped around my fingers. As I poured the tea, I carried the cup outside and stood on the porch, letting the wind brush past my face, the taste of salt sharp on my lips. The dunes before me bent under the steady push of the breeze, each blade of grass swaying like a thought that refuses to settle for long. The sky above was open and pale, the first hints of the sun folded into thin clouds that drifted like scraps of old stories across the hush. I sipped the tea, feeling its warmth spread through my chest as the hush pressed closer, reminding me that I did not need to fill it with anything at all. I stepped off the porch and made my way down the narrow path, my boots sinking into the cool sand where it gathered in small drifts along the edges of the dune grass. The ocean revealed itself slowly, with each step a line of shifting silver that widened until the shore lay open before me, dark and wet where the tide had left its breath. The waves pulled themselves back only to return in soft sighs, the same promise over and over that there is no leaving, only drifting away long enough to come back with new secrets to share. I walked the line where the dry sand met the wet, my boots leaving soft indentations that filled with water as the tide reached for them, then slipped away again. I liked the way the ocean erased me without cruelty, a gentle reminder that my passing here was never meant to last longer than the hush between two waves. I thought of the whales far beneath the rolling surface, how they moved through salt corridors with a trust so complete it made my chest ache, how their songs rose through the hush folding into the tide, and the wind carrying pieces of themselves to places they would never see. I wondered if that was what my questions were for, not to be answered but to be carried out and returned in ways I might never recognize. Standing here at the edge of it all, I knelt and pressed my palm flat against the wet sand, feeling the cold push of water slip between my fingers. The grains shifted under my touch, tiny reminders that even what seems solid is always ready to drift, ready to be shaped by the pull of something larger than itself. I stood and turned back toward the dunes, letting the hush settle into the cuffs of my coat, the folds of my sleeves, the wind catching the collar and lifting it against my neck as if to guide me home. I paused halfway up the path and looked back at the water, the tide still lifting and falling, each wave a breath, each breath a promise that the moon was there even if I could not see it, that its pull would never tire. Even when I did, back inside, I set the cup in the sink and opened the notebook on the table, the pencil waiting where I had left it, its point resting against a blank line, like a question half asked. I did not rush to write. I let the hush fill the space around me, the clock on the wall ticking like a heartbeat, too slow to measure the tide, but steady enough to remind me that time here moved in circles, not lines. I wrote about the ocean today, about how it teaches me to trust the drift, to trust that pulling away is not the same as leaving, about how the moon answers every question, not with words, but with a soft tug at the water, at my thoughts, at the breath I did not know I was holding. I wrote about my mother too, about the way her hush still hums through my ribs, how even now I feel her voice in the quiet between my own questions. I paused, often lifting my eyes to the window where the dunes leaned into the wind, the grass bending but never breaking, always returning to its slow sway as soon as the gusts passed. When the page was full, I closed the notebook and set the pencil across it. the weight of it so slight, yet enough to hold the words in place until I was ready to open them again. I made more tea, the steam curling around my face, as I carried the cup back to the porch, the hush pressing in warmer now. As the sun reached higher, turning the pale sky a softer blue, I thought about tomorrow, and the tide that would return, and the footprints that would vanish, and the hush that would settle into the spaces they left behind. I thought about the whales. Again, how their songs drift like light through water, how maybe they too listen for the hush the same way I do, waiting for it to remind them that they belong to something larger than the dark they swim through. I sipped the tea and closed my eyes, feeling the hush drift through me, the tide inside my chest lifting and falling in quiet agreement with the breath of the sea. I thought about the telescope resting inside by the window, its lens holding the memory of last night's moon, and how tomorrow I might lift it again, let it gather more hush from the stars, let it remind me that looking does not always mean finding, that sometimes it is enough just to stand still and watch the light drift toward you. I stayed like that until the cup grew cold and the wind shifted, brushing my hair back from my face, a small touch that felt like a promise that the hush was not finished yet, that the tide would find me again tonight when the moon rose and the ocean breathed my name back into the sand, just as it always had. When the sun dipped low behind the dunes, the hush grew thick enough to touch. It pressed itself into the corners of the cabin, into the folds of my sweater, into the spaces between my thoughts where old questions lingered soft as salt on my tongue. I sat by the window, my knees pulled close, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the telescope beside me, its glass still smudged from the last time I pressed my eye to it to search the edge of the night for something that would not name itself. The sky above was clear and soft as linen, pale threads of cloud drifting west like thoughts I had once tried to hold and then learned to let go. The tide was out there, breathing its long breath, unseen but steady, the hush of its folding and retreating, lifting and slipping back, a lullaby that asked nothing from me but stillness. I thought of my mother again, how she might have sat by her own window watching the dark gather, wondering if her own small questions would drift far enough to find someone waiting on the other side of them. I wondered if she knew then that I would be here now, carrying her hush in my bones, letting it shape the quiet of my days, the pull of my nights. I rose and lifted the telescope, its familiar weight pressing into my palm, a small gravity that steadied my feet as I stepped outside onto the porch where the boards creaked in the cool evening wind. I stood for a moment, breathing in the salt, the hush, the thin ribbon of dusk stretched across the dunes, the grass bent low under the breeze that carried whispers from the ocean. I liked how the wind moved through me, as if it trusted my ribs to be a passage for its secrets. I walked down the path slow enough to feel the sand give beneath my steps, the grains catching at my soles and slipping away. As I lifted each foot, I paused at the crest where the dunes fell toward the wide open beach. The water caught the last scraps of sunlight and scattered them back in glints that shifted with each wave. The tide was folding in again, curling over itself like a promise made in a language I did not speak, but understood all the same. I set the telescope down, pressing the tripod legs deep into the damp sand so the wind would not pull it sideways. I bent and adjusted the glass, pointing it not at the moon this time, but at the horizon where the sky met the water in a line so thin it looked as if it might break if I breathed too hard. I pressed my eye to the lens and let the world narrow to that single circle where distance and hush made their quiet agreement. I thought about the whales again, far beneath that horizon, moving through their dark salt corridors, their songs slipping past the reach of my ear, but not past the reach of my wonder. I imagined the notes rising through the hush, curling around the glass of the telescope, finding me here alone, but not lonely. I pulled away from the lens and looked with my naked eye. The moon was lifting herself from the edge of the water, her silver face calm and certain as if she had always been. There waiting for me to notice her soft climb, I thought about how she holds the ocean the way memory holds thought, gently yet strong enough to shape the earth beneath my feet. I stepped closer to the tide, letting the waves touch my boots, salt curling into the leather, the cold biting at my ankles. Through the seams I bent and pressed my palm flat to the wet sand, feeling the earth lift a little with each breath of water. I liked the feeling, the slow reminder that even something as wide as the ocean answered to something softer far above, that its hush was born of a pull so gentle it could move mountains one grain at a time. I stood again, letting the breeze carry the hush deeper into my sleeves, my collar, my hair that drifted loose around my neck. I thought of my mother's hands, the way they held the telescope's barrel, the careful way she wiped the glass with the edge of her sleeve, the way her hush wrapped around me when I could not sleep. I thought of how that hush had found its way into my own hands now, how I held it each time I stepped into the dunes or pressed my eye to the sky, how it moved through my breath and my ribs, and my pulse steady as the tide. I lifted the telescope again, this time turning it to the moon, her pale surface soft and scarred at once, each crater a quiet echo of something that had touched her long ago and never quite let go. I wondered if she remembered each collision, each pull, each breath of the tide lifting toward her night after night. I wondered if she knew my small questions drifted her way too, carried on salt air and soft waves. I stepped back and let the hush fill the space where my thoughts had been. Words felt too sharp here, so I let them go, let the hush do what it does best, slip into the soft places and remind me that not every answer must arrive tonight. I packed the telescope away, the lens cool in my palm as I folded the tripod, brushing sand from its legs, the grains catching at my fingertips. Before falling back to the shore, I turned away from the water, letting the tide wash my footprints clean behind me, each step up the dunes lighter than the last, as if the hush itself lifted my feet. I reached the porch where the old boards greeted me with the same soft groan. As always, I set the telescope by the door and stepped inside the cabin. The hush followed close behind, curling around the kettle as I filled it with water, the steam rising slow and thin as the moon's light spilling across the floor. I carried my cup to the window and watched the tide slip forward and back, silver rippling over the dark sand. The hush pressed close, now warm around my shoulders, steady in my chest. I thought about tomorrow, how the ocean would breathe again, how my feet would find the same wet line and leave the same soft prints, how the moon would drift above me and the hush would press its gentle promise into my palms. I thought about my mother's voice, not as an echo now, but as a tide of its own, one that lifts my questions and carries them where they need to go. I sipped the tea, its warmth a small anchor as the hush settled deeper around me, and outside the ocean lifted itself to the moon again, folding its endless breath into the night's wide quiet, ready to return just as I would, ready to lift, ready to drift, ready to trust the hush to hold me one more time.